Hi, Total Wine and More. I'm Amanda McCrossan, and I'm here in Napa Valley with the Wagners. We wanted to give you a little sneak peek at the Vineyards just before we head into our live tasting today. So I'm here with Chuck Wagner, who I'm sure many of you know already. Chuck is here with Jenny and Charlie, and we're going to be bringing you guys in the vineyards to see a few of the grape clusters, how they're coming along before we get into this live tasting.
I think that's a great idea. It's so important to see the vineyards at this time, and it's very interesting as well. Special soils within Napa Valley produce the very finest Cabernet, and we are at one of those sites today. So let's take a look at the grapes.
Hello, I'm Charlie Wagner. We're here in one of our top performing Cabernet vineyards in Rutherford, Napa Valley. Here's a beautiful cluster of Cabernet Sauvignon that we're growing on a hillside here. Today's September 10th, so we're about 2 weeks away from harvesting this beautiful fruit.
All right. Good morning. I'm Jenny Wagner. So like Charlie said, we're about 10 days out of harvesting our top Cabernet here in Rutherford. And I just wanted to show you what the berries are looking like and what we look like for harvest. This berry, you can already see, is a little dimpling. So for us, that's a sign of ripeness. You can see the juice itself is actually clear. So all the color and tannin we get in our Cabernet comes from the skins, which is why it's very important for our skins to have this ripe, dark color, soft texture. And you can see here the seed is starting to darken as well. And then over the next week or two, this will get even riper and the seed will be crunchy and even darker.
I hope you all enjoyed that little preview of the vineyards. We are so excited for harvest here in Napa Valley. I think it's time to taste some wine, so let's get started.
Good afternoon. I'm Chuck Wagner from Caymus Vineyards, right here in Napa Valley, California. We're very happy to be here and pour our wines for you today, and happy that you've assembled to taste along with us. Today I've got my daughter Jenny and sommelier that I think you met on the previous video, Amanda. And with that, we're going to taste our wines. There's one missing person in this today, and that's my son Charlie, who also makes wines. We'll be tasting his wines. He's homesick, so not here today with us. So a little bit about the Wagner family in Caymus and our origins. We are a family-owned and operated winery. I grew up in the middle of Napa Valley in Rutherford on a prune and grape orchard and vineyard, and with that we had a farm, and we were just part of the farm families during agricultural period of Napa. But things happened. The prunes ran out of money for my parents. My dad pulled the trees, planted grapes in the 1960s, and by 1971 I was offered by my parents to join them in the creation of a small commercial winery, which would be Caymus Vineyards, and I joined in. Our first vintage was 1972. Our first production of Cabernet Sauvignon was 250 cases from our property here, and the wine price was $4.50 a bottle. It was a different era, and maybe a decade or two after that, things began to change for Napa Valley. An agricultural preserve came in, which saved the valley from housing. It's considered an agricultural preserve because we have 40-acre minimum parcel size, and only one home is allowed per parcel. With that, we're right next to the San Francisco Bay Area. With that, we're fully agriculture. If you haven't been to Napa, it is monoculture grapes, more manicured and beautiful, I think, every year, and probably more beautiful than it's ever been. A lot of people trying to produce top quality wines. It's a good number of people in Napa Valley, a good number of winemakers that are attempting to make the world's best wine. And while that sounds extraordinary, it does exist. And that competition has driven Napa Valley to heights that I think my forefathers wouldn't recognize and couldn't comprehend, actually. So today, we're going to begin with my daughter's sparkling wine, which is a wine produced under the Amelo label. And of course, Jenny produces other wines in addition to this, most notably Sauvignon Blanc and Merlot. Jenny, you want to start off with the telling us a bit about your sparkling wine?
Yeah, so the first wine that we'll kick off with today, I think there's no better wine than a sparkling for that. So this is the Emelo Sparkling, number 2. This is a non-vintage wine. However, this number 2 is my first introduction into the marketplace. So I did a very small amount of number 1, but I'm proud to kind of introduce this as my first wine. I think it represents where I'm going moving forward with the style. So I guess a little history where this all came from. The truth is my dad went to Champagne in 2012 and came home and said, here's some great champagnes, let's taste them, and you should make some champagne or sparkling wine. So of course I was eager to do that. I love new projects, especially little small projects. I think those are very exciting. So I worked with a consultant and just have been, since 2012, kind of paving my way and trying to figure out my style of sparkling wine. Of course, the inspiration is champagne. I often go to my dad's for dinner, and I walk in the door and he hands me a glass of champagne.
Sure. Why not? It's fun.
Will you come into press and drink a little champagne too?
That's right. Yeah. Who doesn't love sparkling wine?
And I think you've done such a great job with this, Jenny. This has all the great weight and texture that you would want from a sparkling wine, but it also has this great California ripeness that feels luscious and feels like apples, and it just kind of dances on the palate in a way that it feels festive, but it also feels like a wine that I wouldn't mind having with food. And I actually really like it in this glass. I don't think we've had it in a white wine glass quite like this. It works really well.
It brings out the aromas.
Yeah,
more
for
so.
sure.
So that being said, I think it is a California sparkling wine. The sourcing of the fruit is California, but it's non-Napa. It's 3 different coastal regions of California. For this blend, the majority is from Santa Barbara County in the Santa Maria Valley, and also Sonoma County, and then a small amount does come from Monterey as well. And moving
But those
forward,
are all Region 1 cool
Yes.
temperatures, right?
yeah, so that's very important. The cooler coastal regions, I get a longer growing season there. However, I already harvested this year a month ago because those cooler coastal regions really hang on to the bright acidity, which I think, to Amanda's point, does kind of hold on to the citrus, apples a little bit. But I think also with this one, what's important to note is the prolonged aging entourage. So once I've compiled the blend, this wine was aged entourage for 40 months before being disgorged. So that was something that I took inspiration again from champagne, that prolonged aging entourage to kind of bring out more of that toasty creamy character. I think it kind of smells like a biscotti cookie jar. I think a lot of that does come from the prolonged aging, but matched with the kind of California ripe fruit qualities as well.
Yeah. And I think it's important to note, and it even says on the label, I just picked it up to double check, but it does say method traditional, meaning
Yes,
made in a
good
method
point.
that was, more traditional in Champagne. So you're using Pinot Noir and Chardonnay?
Correct. So
Yeah.
the blend on this one is 56% Chardonnay. The remainder is Pinot Noir. Both stainless steel and French oak. Some of the oak is new.
With secondary fermentation happening in bottle. So
Correct.
this is a true sort of champagne-esque sparkling wine, not something else beginning with a P.
Correct.
Correct.
The traditional.
Yes. It's
Okay.
beautiful. I
Thank you.
really love this. This is great work on your part.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh wait, one last thing I wanted to add is that I've been referring to number 2. If you see the bottle, you'll notice a little number 2 on the front and the back as well. That was intentional, that it's non-vintage, but I did want it to be known that number 2, the blend is different from number 1 or number 3 and so forth. The 3 coastal regions remain the same. However, the vineyard blocks may differ between the blends. The Chardonnay to Pinot ratio may differ. The oak regimen may differ. So I was proud to be working with multiple vintages. I think that I realized in the process that I wanted to have that flexibility to bring out more complexity and just have more flexibility to make the blend as best as I could.
And not uncommon to do in Champagne.
Yes.
So great. Well,
Would have thought.
Shall we move on to
yes,
the next wine?
let's get into some Chardonnay.
So, Jenny, do you want to speak about your brother's Chardonnay, or should I?
You can start.
So Sea Sun, this is a new label for Charlie. and this is a genuine, I think, classy Chardonnay that's sold for a very decent price. Sea Sun, of course, is a play on Mer Soleil, and coming from near the ocean. This is 3 different counties producing this wine. Again, they're all Region 1, would be Santa Barbara and Monterey and Suisun Valley. And with that, Charlie's producing partial malolactic, rich, round, very classic. From the nose forward, you can pick this up as being very indicative of Chardonnay. I would consider this wine as just one of my favorite wines these days. Pull out of the refrigerator. Of course, it's a new wine for us,
yeah.
But everybody seems to be loving it, including the family.
Yeah, I love the oak treatment on this. It feels like there's a little bit more of a backbone. It doesn't feel like such a steely, unoaked Chardonnay. There is some neutral French oak on this. And then the partial mallow to give it just a little bit of that creaminess, a little bit of that waxy, weighty texture without it being so buttery and overwhelming. It kind of, another great food wine that sort of takes a step back when you take a bite of food with it.
Yeah, like my dad said, this is a wine that I have chilled in my fridge all the time right now. I've been pulling it out all summer. And it's a crowd pleaser.
Yeah.
People that, I think it suits those that like the more California oaky style, but also the more, the unoaked Chardonnay as well.
It's so true. And I think we often, especially working at a restaurant, and I'm sure for those of you in a retail store, it's so hard to find that balance between finding a wine that people who loved oaked Chardonnays love and people who love maybe unoaked wines. And this does definitely strike that balance. I also really love the twist off, and I love that you guys have sort of embraced that. I think, for me, anytime you can eliminate a variable in the wine buying experience, it's a wonderful thing. So I think that's a great addition. And if you decide to not drink the whole thing for some crazy reason, it's easier to put it back in the fridge that way. So this is drinking beautifully. I'm so excited about this. I feel like every time we go back to it, it gets better.
So probably worth mentioning here, the first 3 wines I can see are basically grown grape vineyards that we planted, and from the very beginning on through. So proud of that. But also Chardonnay is a very special part of California. It is different than French white Burgundy or Chablis. The expression is different. I think that many of the wines of California express like this magical sweetness of the sunshine of California. I think you can taste that in these wines. And in a farming part of our business is large. Not that you may or may not know that, but it's the largest single part of our business in terms of employment, and it's where my mind is probably 80% of the time. I love growing grapes, and I think making wine is fun as well, but probably it's a little bit boring compared to growing grapes. Maybe that's an age thing, I don't know, but I do love the vineyard, I can tell you that.
On his days off, he's on a tractor.
Well, I think we should maybe move into some red wines, and I'm going to ask you to do the thing that we all hate doing most, which is either drink or dump. So we will move on to some things here. Jenny, how are you feeling about this year's harvest? I mean, we were just peeking at your Merlot outside. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so we're just getting started into red grapes for harvest. As I mentioned earlier, I had already picked Chardonnay and Pinot for sparkling 3 weeks ago to a month ago. I also make Sauvignon Blanc under the Emilo label, which is well underway, and I just have some fermentations drying up, but we harvested that a month ago. And today is the first harvest of some Merlot out of Calistoga, which I'll speak more about when we get onto the Merlot. But it looks like a really good year.
It was tasting really good. I was really excited about it.
Yeah, the weather this year is worth mention. We started off with a fairly wet winter, and here came May, and we had this really high temperatures, like 108 is what I recall as being our high. But after that, we had rain. And once the rain went away, we have had just genuinely warm temperatures throughout the summer, free of rain, and temperatures running about 90 degrees in Region 3, which is Cabernet country, and about 78 degrees in the cooler regions, Region 1. But very consistent, good temperatures. And the vines, every winemaker I know is elated about what they see in the vineyard. First fermentations that have just begun. The red wines are already highly extracting red color, darkness, and that's always an indication of quality. While color doesn't mean everything, almost always the goodness, the tannins, the richness, and the concentration of wine follows color. It's always a good indication to have early color during fermentations, which we have this year.
So exciting that we're in harvest. It smells great outside right now. This is one of my favorite parts of living here in Napa Valley, is getting to see everything and smell everything and feel everything, and it's kind of electric right now, right? Like everyone's we're all very busy, mostly you guys, but you know,
Wish
the,
you were
the,
all
the
here.
feeling, I
You'd
know.
probably enjoy it. The weather's great for us, for humans as
it
well.
feels great. Yeah, for
and a little side note, you know that weather that's good for grapes is also good for humans. So if you have a choice in your next life to live somewhere, live in a wine country, I think it's pretty pleasurable environment.
I keep trying to get my parents who are watching, hi Mom and Dad, to move out here, and I tempt them with the weather, but I don't know, maybe they'll vacate from Palm Beach Gardens where they are right now.
Okay, on to Pinot Noir. So this is Charlie's wine also. It's Maresoleil 2017 Pinot Noir from Santa Lucia Highlands of Monterey County. These are vineyards that we planted as well over the last several years. And you may or may not know that Charlie's younger brother Joey makes Belgloss Pinot Noir, very successfully, by the way. So Charlie's just coming on board with this, and we've got excellent fruit to begin with. I love this wine personally, one of my favorite Pinots around. And I'll say a few things about Pinot that I feel. Usually Pinot Noir can smell off to me and taste off to me. I don't really like it, and it's got to be particularly good when it smells like I want to drink it, and after I taste it, I say I want another taste. And I think that's right where this wine is. So of course, some Pinot Noirs can smell of cabbage or rotting cabbage and that sort of thing. So they're kind of off characters, and you have to be a real Burgundy aficionado to really accept those into your heart and soul. And I just have never gotten there. So.
Yeah, no, I think and I am too. I think maybe you are too. You have to be loving of those more savory vegetal flavors, and I think you're someone, especially who loves your wines to smell of fruit, and this definitely captures that essence of that bright cherry, a little bit of that cola berry, not to get too geeky, but it does smell like that kind of like sweet cherry pie a little bit, which I really like.
I like the wood treatment also. One thing that's particularly different about this is Charlie is doing a 1-year cycle, meaning that the wine is produced, fermented in stainless steel, goes in, transfers into barrels. Many of those are new French barrels, and it remains in there until August when it's racked and bottled. So it's a very quick cycle, but he captures, I think, the freshness of the wood and the sweet fruit energy that the fruit has put into the wine. You don't lose that through additional barrel aging or long barrel aging of Pinot Noir. I think that's particularly a surprise in enterprising of Charlie to do that, but I love this wine because of that. The wood is also present in this wine. You get the texture component, the oak quality, oak character, and I think that Pinot Noir character and oak is just a match made in heaven. It's really great wine. I love this wine.
I think Pinot Noir is one of those grapes for me that, too much is too much, and I really feel like it's the right amount of oak that just kind of cradles it, gives it structure, adds a little bit of that spicy element to it, but also backs off and lets the fruit do its thing.
It's got that nice sweet smoke, which I love, and I think it goes hand in hand with what my dad was saying, that Charlie captures it at that young age, just a kind of a shorter period of new French oak, and that I love that. It keeps it fresh, and like my dad, I shouldn't say like my dad. I don't drink a whole lot of Pinot, but this is a wine that I do love. It's just for all those reasons I just said, that freshness.
A little more on Santa Lucia Highlands. It is in Monterey County. It's approximately 15 miles length, about maybe 1 or 2 miles wide. It's on a hillside that faces the Salinas Valley. The Salinas Valley, if you've heard of that, if you haven't heard of it, you can go to your vegetable store. You can find that vegetables usually come from Salinas Valley. It's known to be the salad bowl of America, the Salinas Valley. But that's the bottom land, the rich soil, dark soils down by the river, where you can grow your broccoli and your head lettuce and a dozen other things like that. But it's on the slopes surrounding the Salinas Valley where Santa Lucia Highlands is. So these are all hillside vineyards, and hillsides produce better wines primarily because they're not rich and they don't produce vigorous vines. Vines need to struggle. The foliage itself is small. The leaves themselves are small. The fruit bearing is also, the yield is being low. With that, you get great concentrations off the hillsides. And so Santa Lucia Highlands is along the west edge of the Salinas Valley, reaching from approximately the town of Gonzales to Soledad. 5 miles to the west of Highway 101. You can see it. It's a beautiful site. It's also a place that very few people visit, and it's one of my favorite places. It's a beautiful spot. But the wind does blow there all summer long. The trees are, canted sideways, and you've got to wear a cap. You can't wear a hat because the hat will blow away. That's how windy it is there. So it's,
I feel like you've experienced with that.
Yeah, and I can't quite catch the hat. So.
Temperature-wise, is it pretty different from Napa Valley? Are they getting these, are they diving into 108-degree days like we did this year?
No, not at all. I think, so again, it's Region 1. So the state of California is carved into 5 regions, 5 being the hottest, cool being the, number 1 being the coolest. And the way to, I think, to relate to that is Cabernet country is Region 3, and we might have 90 degrees as our average high temperature during the day. And Region 1 down in Santa Lucia Highlands would be 78 degrees on that day. And those are the differences. And if we grow Chardonnay up here in warm region, it ripens early and it has a wines of no distinction and no greatness. They're very thin. On the other hand, if we were to plant Cabernet Sauvignon in the Santa Lucia Highlands, those wines come out being very vegetative and pyrazine laden, so they smell like vegetables and not necessarily like good Cabernet Sauvignon.
Right.
So those are the differences. I think there is one thing to add to that. The varieties that are planted appropriately in California, each one of them should ripen fully the day before the onset of winter. So if you've got say Cabernet you're trying to grow in a cool country and you can't get it ripe and the winter comes, well, it's curtains. You're not going to make any good wine out of that. And so everything's judged around that for us. That's the way we look at it. Try and get a lot of hang time, get into, say, middle of October with the primary part of your harvest, and not August or September with Cabernet. That would be making wines that are thin without that concentration that's so important.
When do you think Charlie will harvest Pinot from Santa Lucia Highlands?
I don't know. I haven't. Oh, too bad he's not here to answer that question. So.
We got a mosquito.
Should we move on?
Yes.
Okay.
So the next red wine we're going to be tasting today is the Emelo Merlot. This is the 2017, and this Merlot comes from Napa Valley, primarily Oak Knoll. So I don't know how familiar you are with Napa Valley, but we're about 30 miles long, 3 miles wide at the widest point. Oak Knoll is just almost the center of the valley, a little more south, which is a little bit cooler. So even though, to kind of give you some perspective, Rutherford, where Caymus Vineyards is what we call center of the valley. And if we drive about 5 minutes south of Rutherford, we're in Oak Knoll. Even though it's so close, it could be on a hot summer day about 7 degrees cooler. And that is important, I think, for Merlot because it's an early ripening variety. So we talked about hang time in the cooler coastal regions with Pinot and Chardonnay. Hang time is important for all of our wines, but with the earlier ripening Merlot in the cooler Oak Knoll area, it extends that hang time. So at harvest time, the fruit is very ripe, dark, concentrated. The seeds are crunchy, brown, the skins are soft. Very similar characteristics of what our Cabernet looks like at harvest. So I've kind of taken what I've learned working under my dad in the Caymus winemaking team with Cabernet and applied a lot of those same farming techniques and fermentation techniques to Merlot to kind of achieve this softer, concentrated, round, soft tannin, that all those things are the style I'm going for with Merlot, which I do think is unlike a lot of other California Merlots. So we still see, I'm sure Amanda sees it in the restaurant at press all the time.
Oh yeah.
People not wanting Merlot. But
Well, I was just going to ask you, and we were very proud to do this by the glass, the 2016 at press. This was just such a hit for us. But there is this sort of stigma that is still out there with Merlot, and I wonder if you have, if you feel like that's changing. I feel like it's changing. I feel like more and more people are starting to come around to this idea of Merlot. One, because it's delicious, and two, because I think you can get a little bit more bang for your buck. And a wine like this, that's clearly made with just as much, if not more, integrity than a Cabernet that might taste or might be 3 times as expensive. This this over delivers by a mile for me.
Well, thank you. I do think it's changing. A lot of times it is getting the wine in the glass for people that
For sure.
don't like Merlot. So it does make my day when somebody says that Emelo Merlot has kind of changed their perspective on the variety, the Merlot variety itself.
Yeah. I think for me, the Merlot always has, it's a textural thing, and it always has all of the great fruit nuances of something like a Cabernet, but texturally it's a little bit more soft, a little more plushy, more velvety. So for someone that doesn't love the astringency of a Cabernet that can sometimes throw off like really big tannins, this sort of curves that a little bit. This offers a middle ground, so to speak.
Yeah, and we're gonna taste the Caymus Cabernet next, but I think that being said is the acidity, it is a little, it's toned down from Cabernet. It is a little bit softer in that regard. And I think to farming practices, as my dad mentioned, that's, farming is our largest part of our business. And I think, it's important for all of our varieties, but of course Merlot is kind of my baby and the wine that I make. And I really think it's important, especially with this variety, to manage the yield and ensure that it's low yield, a healthy crop. Because I think that has been part of the problem with Merlot over the years is, it being an overly producing and a heavily cropped variety, and in turn making a kind of an uninteresting, lighter style, higher acid wine. So we do a lot of hands-on manipulation and throughout the growing season to ensure that what's hanging on the vine can get fully ripe to our liking. Yeah.
So your primary farm for this is owned by your grandparents, Jenny's maternal side, the Emelos, and Frank and Annie, who I hope will be able to see this, and hello, Frank and Annie.
I'm sure
they're always watching Jenny's work because the Merlot she's growing, most of it comes from their land, and she's got to answer for it. So when she goes over there for Italian lunch, their neighboring Caymus in Rutherford, they'll drink this wine, and the parents or the grandparents are very proud of what Jenny's doing with the land that the Emelos owned. They own three different ranches in Napa Valley. Years ago, the Emelos were grapevine nursery people, and more lately transferred out of nursery and into farming grapes, which we farm, which Jenny farms, I should say, this Merlot and also the Sauvignon Blanc. So the interesting thing about Emelos, a family that came in from
Sicily.
Sicily.
And, they've been in Napa since the 1920s, and as my dad mentioned, their main business was nursery farmers. So their nursery was called Emelo, which is why today I'm proud to continue on the Emelo name on a wine bottle, because they do have long farming history in Napa Valley as well. And they have their vegetable garden right now is just in full throttle. It's amazing. I go there weekly for lunch, and we'll be canning the last of their tomatoes in the next couple weeks as the season for the vegetable garden slows down. But they always do have a bottle of Emelo on their table at lunch.
I was just going to ask you, are you drinking Emelo when you go over for some lunch?
Sometimes I'll have a little sip, but I've got to go back to work, so
Yeah.
they indulge.
Yeah. And I didn't know they were from Sicily, which is kind of cool.
Yeah,
and you
Emelo
worked
is a
with-
Sicilian name.
Oh, you worked with some Sicilian varietals last year, right?
I did a couple, just about a barrel worth of wine. But yeah, it's I loved, as I mentioned earlier, the smaller projects. So even just a few rows of an Italian variety and seeing if it makes something
Fantastic.
special.
Well, let's move on to Cabernet. And I'll tell you that the truth, I just tasted both these wines, and the Emelo Merlot is just about every bit as good as the Caymus Cabernet. And so on to the Caymus Cabernet. This is our 2017 vintage. Definitely this is a good indicative of the quality that we make, the character in the wine. I think it's a very important part of what we do, actually. It's our most important, I think, what we're known for. And what about Cabernet and Caymus? And what some people consider special is there's a unique character in the wine. I believe it's a singular character that has to do with how we grow grapes. We do much of our farming is dry farmed without any irrigation, and we pick extremely ripe, and we produce wines that do not have the hard tannins. They're not bitter on the palate. Picking very ripe also means that the acidity is lower, so the wine does not end up being overly tart. So I like the harmony value, the balance of the wine, where you've got texture, a lot of tannin texture, but it's not bitter. You've got acidity that makes the wine fresh, yet it's not tart. And it allows you to taste beyond that the flavors of Cabernet Sauvignon, of course, blended with wood after a wood aging, which is typically a little over a year for our Cabernet. Our Cabernets are not just grown at the Caymus property. We are growing grapes and receiving grapes from 8 of the 15 sub-appellations of Napa Valley. About 25% of our Cabernets, speaking both of Special Selection and Napa Valley, about 25% of that can come off of the hills. It's 75% in the valley floor. The valley floor vineyards, we always seek out vineyards sites that have a lot of gravel, where vines have to struggle a bit. Staying away from the rich soils along the rivers and that sort of thing with Cabernet is important. We get good extract if we can get into those good, better, hard to live in soils, and that's been key for us. We're producing of the mountainside. Our primary production area is Atlas Peak, where the fires came in 2017, which comes into question about this wine right here, because this is a wine that was produced out of that fire vintage. So that's not a big issue for us in terms of the time, that period. It was a bad memory. We lost 45 acres in vineyard. We had a small winery up on Atlas Peak that burned. We had lost 42 barrels of Special Selection Cabernet, we believe is that quality. But we had lost no people, and none of our people lost homes that work at Caymus anyway. So the smoke issue is probably something that's present in your mind, you're questioning about, and what damage that can make or effect it can have on wines. There is a compound that comes from smoke that gets into the vine, into the grape, and transfers right into the wine, guaiacol. And so we can check guaiacol in the vineyard before we crush the grapes, and we can also check guaiacol after the wine is produced to see what it's got. And what does that mean, and is it unhealthful? Well, I think it's, the way that I look at it is, if you've got high smoke content in a wine, especially Cabernet or something like that, it begins to smell like an ashtray, or not a very wonderful fire character. And also think about the other products of the world that have a lot of that compound of smoke. Think of mezcal, or think of scotch, and those sorts of things. And so it's not necessarily unhealthy, it's just unpleasant with wine. So we're very careful about that. We have checked our guaiacol compound in this wine, and it's at minimum levels, and we're happy with it. No one has said anything about this wine smelling or tasting of smoke. Happy about that.
No, it certainly does not smell or taste of mezcal or smoke or barbecue or anything like that. And it smells fantastic, in fact. And I'm actually, 17, aside from the fires, was actually a really wonderful vintage. And maybe you can speak to that fires aside, what was that vintage like as far as a growing season?
Well, we had most of our grapes were in. Just our later blocks were still out in the field. It was October 17th, if I recall, and so that part was good. It was we had everything in stainless steel, and it was fermenting and clean and good. I think looking back now, you just have to put a different hat on for a minute and don't remember the horribleness of the 17 fires, and look towards the great vintages that were made during that year.
Yeah.
Which this is another wine that's going to be a 17.
And even aside from the vineyard sites that had smoke taint, I think it's also what was worth noting that vintage is all the fermenting tanks we had. We had the majority of our red wines were fermenting at that time, and all the power was out for days, and we had minimal. People couldn't get to work. We just kind of had to let nature run its course for those few days, and it's pretty amazing to see how wines turned out from that vintage. And a strong fermentation was a good thing because the tanks just kept fermenting through, and it was it had a heavy gas, keeps the wine from being oxidized, and everyone seemed to make it happen.
Yep.
It was a strong sense of community during that time.
It really was.
Yeah.
So we're on to the next wine, and if you haven't had this, Caymus Susun Grand Durif, I am so pleased for you to taste it today. This is a new wine for us. We've been producing it for 3 years. It comes from Susun Valley, which is just about 40 minutes drive from Rutherford to the vineyards of Susun Valley. It's, even though it's not part of Napa County, it's right next to the county and very much similar. The weather conditions and soils are similar to Napa Valley. So with that, we expect that Petit Syrah would do extraordinarily well in that soil, and we've tasted some of the wines being made by some old home winemakers here, some older vintages, and those wines were exceptional. And so our interest, our focus of Cabernet, once we moved over to Susun Valley, our focus really began to be Petit Syrah. I grew up with Petit Syrah. I love the wine, but sometimes it can be very tannic and big, and it may be over the top. They can be black in color, overly tannic, bitter, and not really so much fun to drink unless you're a purist. So with that, we went forward applying some of the same techniques, how we grow Cabernet Sauvignon in Napa Valley, dry farm, crop reduced, and very ripe harvest time, and produced a very soft style. So during fermentation, we do not extract all of the tannin and color that the grapes have to offer. We end up looking at this differently and tasting it daily and being very careful about how we're going to extract color and tannin in this wine. In addition to that, we blend in lighter red wine that has low tannin content to help finish the wine and make it round and pure. I'm excited about this wine. I think this wine would do well on any table. I say Petit Syrah like this probably lends itself to being barbecued meats, especially, and maybe lamb, that sort of meat especially, and or cheese. So with that, Petit Syrah is in the field at this time, not too far off from its harvest. And I was able to find a cluster this morning of Petit Syrah, and you can see that it's very tight, a lot of berries, and if you look close, you can see the berries have a little bit of dimpling, and that dimpling is so important. When we get inside that berry, with the dimpled berry, you're going to have a brown seed. It'll be crunchy, not green, not tart, and that's really truly ripe grapes. So with this would make a great Petit Syrah wine, a great Grand Durif. So Grand Durif is the name Grand Durif. Why we chose it instead of calling it Petit Syrah is worth a few moments. Durif is a synonym name for Petit Syrah. We can use either. It's interchangeable. Our own addition to this wine, the name of this wine was Grand, so it's Grand Durif. To me, it seemed appropriate because Petit Syrah refers to something being small, like a small wine. And if there's any wine that's larger than life, it's Petit Syrah. So to put a word grand on there, I think makes some sense. So I hope you like this. I'd really love to hear what you have to say about it. I wish you were all here to opine
Well,
about it.
I'll tell you what I think about it. I've had the great privilege to taste some of the oldest wines ever made in California and working with the press wine list and, of course, going back into the 50s and 60s history of California, some of my favorite and most surprising wines that I've tasted are, in fact, Petit Syrah. And I think that's surprising to a lot of people who taste Petit Syrah of this current era. And I think, there is a great richness and a fruit component that is very distinctive. It tends to be a little darker. It always feels, I think of a color when I think of this wine. I always think of purple. But there's also a great salinity, which I've always enjoyed. And I think this wine, speaks to me in a way that feels very old school California. And I think of the Suisun Valley as this, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit more, as this place that feels like Napa Valley, but like back in the 60s. And so to me, this is like such a great heritage varietal that works so well with this place and in this glass. And I think this is just such a special wine. I'm really, really excited that you're doing this in a way that feels a little bit elevated than it used to be.
Yeah, it kind of has that, like on the finish right now, I get like a little rustic, we talk about home winemaking character, which I think maybe is what you're referring to, but I love that kind of rustic quality, but it is very ripe berry.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, a little bit more on the Suisun Valley. Wish Charlie was here to speak to this. We have under construction at this time the Caymus Suisun Winery, and I have a rendering of it here that you can take a look at. This is actually the tasting room and area, and does not include the picture does not include the barrel room, which is addition to this. But we do believe that if you come to California, into the wine country, in a few years, if you don't come to Suisun Valley, I think it was a mistake. It's absolutely like Napa was when I was a kid, 1950s, 1960s. And the people here in the Suisun Valley are very genuine, and they're all farmers. There is a couple of things about Suisun Valley that's similar to Napa. One is that agricultural preserve I spoke about in Napa Valley also exists in the Suisun Valley. So some of the four founders here, some of the older farmers got together and said, let's protect what we have, let's protect the agriculture. And so they have 20-acre minimum, one home per parcel, and going to make a wine valley out of Suisun Valley. So I believe you'll hear more about it, and I sure hope you will visit it in the future. One way to remember the name Suisun is see you soon in Suisun. So with that, there's only about a dozen wineries here, and I think everybody's excited about the prospects, and it's very accessible, easier to get to, say, from San Francisco, Oakland, or Sacramento Airport than it is to get to Napa Valley. So we don't have quite the traffic problem as we have in the valley. I love Napa Valley, don't get me wrong. It's just that this takes me back to a time of childhood that I love so much about Napa Valley. It's right here in the Suisun Valley.
Yeah, hearing your excitement, Chuck comes into the restaurant quite a bit, and he would tell me all the time, like, we're looking at Suisun, this is what's happening, and he would tell me all these stories, and he had such passion and enthusiasm for this region that I'd never heard of. And then finally one day you took me out here, and we cruised around for like half a day, and it was like, I get it. This is so cool, and there is this sort of rusticity, there is this community element, and it does feel like if I had to imagine what Napa Valley was like back in the 60s and 70s, like all the stories that I've heard and I've read, this Suisun does have that feeling, that feeling of old school and just ready to like explode in a great way.
On the side from the wine grapes, you'd pull over off the side of the road, and there's these little farm stands with the best peaches you've ever had, and the best strawberries. That part's fun too.
Even at the restaurant, we actually source a few of our tomatoes from Tembering Farms. Yeah, so it's really exciting. There's great little bars around here and restaurants.
Yeah, very agricultural.
Very cool.
Okay, on to the last wine, which is going to be our top wine. At least I believe it's our top wine. I hope you agree.
I don't know. These all kind of gave it a run for its money today, right?
Caymus, 2015 special selection. About 20% of our Cabernet production is special selection. And how that's selected is quite simple. We ferment all of our lots of Cabernet, usually about 70 different fermentation lots. Several are very small and some are medium size. And after harvest in December, we'll line up all of those wines blind. We don't know where they come from, what origin, whether they came from Atlas Peak or Calistoga, etc. And we choose the very best of the year, and we keep that wine back for special selection. It's only after we make that decision do we unmask the bottles and see what we've actually chosen. So in a way, it's a very honest technique, and we've found that depending on the year, we can find the quality, say in Okanole area that's a little bit cooler some years, and other years Calistoga might be extraordinarily well. So with that, this wine is full of just what I expect of special selection. I think this has just been reported to get a Wine Spectator rating of 90, 95. I think that's right. Personally, I think it should be 100.
So in these tastings my dad's talking about, we do our first one in December following harvest, tasting all of our red lots blind. And so we pretend as if we're the wine Spectator and the Caymus winemaking team. There's 5 of us. We go around the table and we'll smell a fermentation lot, taste it, and he'll start a little timer for 3 minutes, and we jot down our score and our notes, and we talk about it. And at that point, we're typically all on the same page. So this tastes like a 90, 95, and somebody might be, no, it's an 89 or it's a 99. So those are really, really fun and really telling. I love those tastings because that's really where I think we determine if maybe we tried a vineyard practice that was different from our standard, if that's something we would continue or not, or if we bought grapes from a grower, or if it's the first harvest off vines we planted. Those tastings are telling if we would move forward, and of course starting to differentiate between special selection and Caymus Napa Valley Cab.
There's another important part about this, and that is that, I'm enjoying this business and active as always, but I won't last forever. We love to think that the tradition of Caymus, that singular quality of Cabernet, that style, carries on to the next generation. So I think we've already confirmed that with the group tasting and what our endpoint, what we're trying to produce. And while we're trying to produce a 100-point wine, it's really less important to us. What's more important is to produce a wine that tastes like Caymus Cabernet. And we have a great clientele that we're very proud of, that likes our wine. Why would we vary from that? So with that, I think we've got generations in mind, and just remain in the family from here on. So back to well, I hope you tasted the Cabernet, and it's a little higher tannin than the Napa Valley bottling. It's ageable, more ageable. I think it peaks at somewhere around 10 or 15 years. You might want to speak a little bit about its ageability.
Well, we've had a couple questions come in, and you've just answered one, which is what distinguishes the special selection from the Napa Valley Cabernet, which I think was answered. The second one is a great question, and one that we could probably all speak to, which is, what are some of your favorite vintages of special selection? What's the oldest vintage you've enjoyed recently? So I'll let you start if you'd like, because I've had a few.
Yeah, so really, Amanda's got a list of probably 20 old Caymus wines,
I think it's more
more.
than that, yeah.
And I'll say this, I mean it, I think you know more about our old wines than we do ourselves. I could say that for all of the valley. You probably have tasted more aged Napa Valley wines than any single person I know. And with that, you can speak about the ageability. I'm surprised that our wines can last as long as they do. And we've had wines that are 30 and 40 years of age that are still interesting and good. Now, that's different than peak, right? So we talk about Caymus Special Selection in its peak. I believe it's somewhere around 10 years up to 15 years, something like that. But they don't just fall off a cliff and turn into vinegar. They actually stay very interesting for another decade and or more. So if I were you, I'd probably keep that 10 or 12 year old in your mindset. Keep a few bottles for long ageability, but otherwise consume on the, say, 10 to 12 years. So the grapes for Cabernet Sauvignon, I pulled this off. It is not ready to pick, but you can see the difference here between Petite Syrah. The color itself on Petite has got a cobalt blue color, and it's a darker wine, as you might expect. And Cabernet Sauvignon is very interesting. It looks, if you take it off of the cluster and look at it, it looks just like a blueberry. It's got the same color blue. In both of these varieties, for that matter, if you don't know, that these are both vinifera species, and both of these have clear juice. So I'm not sure if you can get a shot of this, but you can see that they're clear juice. And all of the color is in the skins. So this is so important to have skins, and it's how, during fermentation, we react to those skins, mixing the juice in some way with those skins to make the extraction of color and tannin from these skins. And that's basically how we make wine. That's why you see I Love Lucy stomping on the grapes in the barrel, and or you see people on top of tanks with sticks that are pushing the cap down, mixing it into the juice below. But technique-wise, every winemaker's a little different on that. Some people have a technique that they believe is the very world's best, and it's quite different than the next guy. So that's why we can have 500 different Cabernet wines out of Napa Valley, and they all seem to taste different,
That's
I think.
Yeah. You know, there was a question about the notion of tannin and what that means in the actual wine, and I think just from my point of view and what I was taught, and maybe you guys have your own opinions, tannin comes from two different places. One would be the grape skins, and then the other would be from the wood that it's aged in. And so they present as different things, but tannin is a really good thing because we want there to be structure. We want there to be a backbone to the wine, but it also can be a little bit overwhelming if it's done too heavily. So if there's too much extraction, too much skin contact, too much wood treatment, it can give you that dryness.
Balance.
It's balance. And I wonder how you feel about, approaching the tannin. How do you strike that balance between there being structure and being that backbone without it being overwhelming?
Well, I think I explained on the fermentation of Petit Syrah, we're always managing that. And so we actually go by palate. We taste every morning, but we do back our palate up with the lab analysis. Because when you have wine that still has a lot of residual sugar during fermentation, it shades and hides the tannins. You're unable to taste them. So we run to the lab with samples when we're concerned that we might be extracting too much, and we have tannin content analysis done on the grapes, and that helps us. It helps back up what you believe in your heart and what you believe on your palate.
Well, I will tell you what my favorite, just going back to that special selection question of favorite vintages, because when you age these wines, you are going to dive into some other territories once you get past that 10 to 15 year bracket. And I really like them. I think, they're quite different, but one of my favorite vintages that's drinking, I think, very well is the 1990. And I love how structured it is, but you do start to dive into some of those, what we call like secondary and tertiary, which is like a geeky term for things that taste like tea and overturned earth and a little bit of tree bark, but there is still a lot of fruit and a lot of freshness. And so I'm never afraid, I think because of where I work, to age a wine a little bit longer, but to your point, 10 to 15 years seems to be the point where we lose all of that really lovely like front palate fruit, that juiciness, the freshness, or not freshness, but the vivacity of that fruit. Have you had any older vintages of special selection recently?
I think just my dad being my dad, growing up, or once I was an adult, I go to his house and we typically drink younger wines.
Sure.
Today, when I pull out a bottle at dinner, it's typically a current release. However, I think the last year or so, when we pull out a special bottle, it's typically been an 08 or an 09. I personally think the 09 is it's got the perfect smoke. It is still it's still young and fresh. And I remember my dad loving that vintage and he was not really pleased with the score it got. I remember the critics didn't think it was such a great vintage, and now it's just funny looking back 10 years later.
Yeah. It is a beautiful wine. We've actually served a few bottles of that, and to your point, I think one of the beauties of Caymus and special selection is that they don't need to be aged. You guys are drinking it at Total Wine right now. These wines, you pull the cork and they're really, really beautiful right out of the gate. And that is one of the things that sort of separates us here in California from the rest of the world, is this ability to make wines that are approachable early on, and really not even approachable, but very, very delicious.
Well, and in what year would you say making Caymus Cabernet is what you changed style from wanting to make more of a, Bordeaux was the top of that?
Yeah, it's good point. So let me speak to that. I think that Cabernet Sauvignon, we began our business in 1972 with my dad's homemade style, which was good. And 73 just made itself as extraordinary wine. set us apart, seen from some of the neighbors. But then we learned about Bordeaux, and we thought, well, if those are the best wines in the world, then we should try to emulate what the French do. So we'd have our first growth tastings and try to produce those wines. And I went on for many years, maybe a couple of decades, where we looked at the French wines. But things began to change in Napa Valley for different reasons. One is a French consultant came over by the name of Michel Roland, and he started producing wines that were produced from riper grapes, and we really impressed with that. I think the first Harlan wines were very impressive for me. And after that, it began to show differently. Napa Valley began to change its focus. It no longer tried to emulate Bordeaux and began to compete with one another within the valley. So now it's an expression of Cabernet Sauvignon from the soils of Napa Valley. And it's quite different, far different from Bordeaux. So I love what we're doing, but that is the story. And by 2000, we did make our changes, and by 2001, we clearly had gone on to a riper style where the acidity is a little lower, the tannins are less bitter, and the approachability upon it release was just fantastic. I think you can love these wines right out of the blocks. But they still age okay. And I think the 2001 is drinking extraordinarily well right now. Speaking of that, being the oldest wine of the new style, I'm very proud of that wine. So with that, we're going to close. I want to thank all of you absolutely for being here, and for Total Wine & More to give us this opportunity to provide our tasting of our wines to so many of you. We're very proud of what we do, as you can tell, but we're very proud that we're able to reach you, and you're able to taste our wines and hear a little bit about our story. I'm happy to have my daughter Jenny here. I wish Charlie was not sick, but so be it. Maybe next year he'll be here. And especially this time around, we've got Amanda McCrossan to thank for being here and help us with being a little bit more professional. If you do come to Napa Valley, let me say that you should go to Press Restaurant because that's where she's the somm, and she tastes all the wines before they come to the table.
I do.
Even if there could be a 1955 or 59 Cabernets, you get to taste them.
Somebody's got to do it.
Really, I'd like your job for a while. It's like a lot of fun.
We'll trade.
And with that, we're going to sign off and say thank you very much. And I hope you have a great year. We'll see you next year. Thank you.
Thank you.